building Feminist IR Networks. Not only am I a participant in a Feminist IR network, predominantly through my role as one of the co-editors-in-chief of the Feminist IR Journal, the International Feminist Journal of Politics. That's the main way that I've been operating within Feminist IR Networks for the last couple of years. And before that, I don't know if I would identify most of my work as centered in this network. However, it did definitely overlap with other networks that I've been involved with, because my own research and interests are research interests that have to do with what we, in that vast arena of what we consider to be international relations, and how that cross-cuts a more regional and national focus, particularly around, if you will, feminist and IR networks of activism, rather feminist and queer networks of activism, particularly when it comes to social mobilization. I call these observations from a co-conspirator because, again, I am honored to be considered a fellow traveler with your initiative, and again, to emphasize how much of what I know I have learned from people located in Latin America. So speaking of location, and this goes a bit more to what Natalia has already set out from a previous conversation that we had in terms of my reaction to thinking about you all building a feminist IR network and what that looks like from somebody who's spent a long time observing how particularly feminist, but also queer networking has worked in Latin America. So, of course, it seems as if where you are located is in pushing out the boundaries of the IR field of international relations. And as it was explained to me in a previous meeting, as I understand from the sort of academic institutionality, that institutionality around international relations comes from the building out of perhaps even separate facilities of international relations, courses, programs, faculties, centers, even schools that are seen as focusing on international relations as its own field of study, rather than, say, a subfield of political science. That there is a growing institutionality of international relations where many of you are either centrally located or you have a more tangential relationship with the field. And that in general, as we know, as part of the institutional apparatus of the academy, the IR institutionality is really a cis het male stream, academic project. This will not come as a surprise to any of you. That is true across the academy, but we can really see this when we look into that sort of institutionality, that institutional existence. The IR field, like many academic fields, is one that was established in the West, in countries that consider themselves at the center of global processes. And as such, there's a real Western hegemony to the IR field. And that's a Western hegemony that really centers things such as, I brought up vanguard positioning too early, and I'm taking that away because this is no longer, if it ever was, vanguard positionality. Here we're talking about centering the study of the Westphalian state system, or wringing our hands about where it's going to go in the future, thinking about the spread of neoliberal market logics, the way those things are interrelated, but having hegemonic, sort of centering those hegemonic views around whether those are political models and systems or economic models and systems. And I would take this and include within that Western hegemony Marxist perspectives. Because at this point, again, I'm not going to spend any time on this because you know this better than I do. Old line Marxism is part of that hegemony. So even having Marxist perspectives included in this, they're included now routinely included into how the IR field is taught and understood, without often their most revolutionary implications deeply incorporated into the epistemic stakeholding that happens in the IR field. So this is an institutionality that I understand is growing across Latin America, has grown inside Brazil. And you all have a vanguard positionality within that broader IR institutionality. So you're trying to push out those boundaries from within. As far as I understand some of the work that's gone forward, for example, through Mulheres and the other initiatives that I learned about when I was so fortunate as to visit with many of you in São Paulo in that glorious time that we could be face to face and share and share in the convite and share in the brindis and share in our face-to-face exchange, which I deeply hope we'll be able to do again. But as Natalia pointed out, we want to take full advantage of the learning that we are all going through together during this time of the pandemia. Okay, so in terms of feminist and queer work here, as you all know, there has been a very robust development of feminist and queer perspectives within the IR frame that has happened, as I put here, globally to this point. As a co-editor of the Central Journal in this area, a journal that has recently celebrated its 20-year anniversary, right? That's decades of, theoretical development, empirical development, epistemological development. We have our own conferences, we have our own networks. I know our editorial team, alongside things like the FTGS section of the International Studies Association, has really pushed open those IR boundaries from a set of critical perspectives. But I put globality in scare quotes to draw your attention to the fact that one of the main challenges to this robust development has been to position it in a truly global perspective. And I know that from the vantage point of working from inside the journal and with the conference development, that initiatives such as the initiative that took place in Brazil and in Mexico to ground feminist and queer IR in experiences in different world regions, is a critical part of trying to make the expansion of feminist and queer work really global, genuinely global, in that it reflects and is grounded in the experiences of activists and academics literally from around the world. And that is absolutely a challenge to us, which brings along a whole set of challenges that the kind of work that you're doing, right, again, is at the vanguard of. Okay, so this is for the future. This has not happened yet. So that's why initiatives such as the initiative you are all working on is so very exciting to those of us who have had the opportunity to be, if you will, more centrally located within the feminist and queer IR space. So that's what I've just said. The need for regional rooting and insights, I think, is one of the most, exciting places that this work can go forward. Because as you all know, when you're in a moment of having to work on this in your own context, even when that's happening nationally, you can only go so far in terms of really pushing back to decenter, what the global has meant, given that even the concept of the global came out of a real Western conceptualization. I know that one of the most dramatically important innovations that's come out of the Latin American region is to decolonize the academy from all sorts of vantage points. Well, if you take a decolonial perspective on the global, right, that really just blows open a situatedness that I think many of us have gotten too comfortable with in thinking of the global as sort of this ideal representation of every world region or even every national region. Well, if you take a decolonial perspective on that, what does the concept of representation then mean? Are you going to try to represent different peoples, different cosmologies? You can see how much rich work there is, work that, of course, Brazilians are at the forefront of in doing this sort of, really vital academic theorizing. Okay, but this is where it seemed to me from a friendly outside co-conspirator perspective that the work that you're doing is currently positioned. And my question for the Tibira team from that perspective is I hadn't seen quite how it drew from my understanding of feminist and queer genealogies in Brazil and more broadly in the Latin American region, which has had what seems like perhaps a separate development through, for example, gender and queer studies. Whether that was through the development of curriculum and university courses, through the development of gender studies and queer studies institutionality through building university centers, through regular meetings where people would share their work, and of course, very important in the academic space, through various publications like Cadernos Pagu, and other fairly well-known publications, Debate Feminista out of Mexico, for example, and well, you know these better than I do. So from my perspective, as somebody who from graduate school days was interested in understanding, appreciating, and learning from, say, feminist social movements, the interlocutors from Latin America over these last 20 years, more than 20 years, it's been a long time since I've been in graduate school, there has been this extraordinary institutionalization and expansion of this arena of academic work. And so to hear that you didn't necessarily immediately position yourself within this genealogy was very interesting to me, because it would seem to me that there should be some useful connections, again, to a realm of academic work that seems so established and advanced, to the perspective of somebody who doesn't live this on a daily basis in her own academic trajectory. But of course, since I started doing my work, I've been invited, I've been affiliated with, my first affiliation was for, fairly early days, but a Center for Women's Studies at the Central University of Venezuela. That's where I affiliated as a graduate student. And that was in the early 1990s, right? And then, those centers also have regional networks and on and on. So I don't need to go on and on about this, but that seems to me to be a very important arena for for you to find interlocutors, and maybe some of you are already located within that. So figuring out how your budding network can be nurtured from, if nothing else, at least the models that they, and the tried and true experiments that they've already had, seems to me very potentially fruitful arena. Particularly because gender and queer studies in Latin America has been intimately related, of course, and in many cases come out of feminist and queer activism. I know that from the beginning, again, of my ability to exchange with people doing the kind of research and activist work in the region, is that they very rarely saw themselves as pure academics, that always their academic trajectories were intimately related to their activist trajectories, and they didn't see this as separate. Many of them they were bringing their activism into the academy where it had a very important role to play. And here I would say that Latin American academies in general have seen more fluid permeation of what in the United States is supposed to be a very hard and fast boundary. But that, so that there's been a real synergy there. And it's a synergy that I've noticed in my very recent research, which is that this institutionality has provided a floor for the vibrant new generations of activism that have literally exploded the boundaries of activism around bodily integrity and bodily sovereignty in Latin America. That many of those activists have been nurtured, whether they knew it or not, but many of them do claim this, by their experiences in the classrooms of an early generation of feminists and queer activists who saw that the classroom would be a key point, for changing society effectively. So it's, figuring out how you all are positioned around this it seemed to me a really vibrant and possibly nurturing area for the expansion of your own networks. And then just a few things on network organization, and this may be preliminary because it's I don't know how far these discussions have advanced, but I know an outdoor was emphasizing that possibly in your last half hour today you might be thinking a little more pragmatically about, okay, so what might this network look like as we move forward with our work, and so here my excitement comes in that the network organization is an extraordinary gift to the world from Latin America, as far as I see it, particularly in the arenas of feminist and queer organization. In that the network model is very deeply historically rooted in the activism, initially around feminism, and then later with regards to sort of the queer subject space across the region. And this is something, I'm not a historian, but my work is informed by historical analysis. And I feel like every time I write something about activism in the region, I have to remind my readers who are not familiar with the region that the network form goes all the way back. So it's deeply historically rooted. It's also very widespread because, I'm trying to think, I would say by the middle of the 1990s, the regional articulation, as well as national articulation through redes, right? It was natural. It was a learned format that, as for example, the articulation of not a new identity, but a newly articulated identity. So Afro-Brazilian lesbian identity, that kind of articulation was generally articulated through a network organization rather than isolated organizations. So that by the mid-1990s, the articulation of an identity politics was an articulation that would go through, okay, let's form a network. Let's form a network like you are doing. And you know, I don't know, but you know why you've sort of almost immediately thought about having a network. And I'm just here to say that's something that is, I would say, in the air, in the water, in the atmosphere, in the ecosystem that I've seen in the region, nationally in Brazil, nationally in other countries as well. Very widespread. And it's been very effective. It's been extraordinarily effective, as you all have been living through, right? I would say since the 2010s. I'm not going to rehearse that history because, again, you've lived it. But networks have supported the mass mobilization that has been an extraordinary achievement in Brazil and across Latin America that we don't see anywhere else, as far as I can tell, in the world. The massification of movements that center gender and sexuality, right? That comes out of a network expression. And that's amazing. Also, networks have been very effective at doing things like diffusing not only ideas, but also policy and having legislative achievements, even though they're never what they should be in the region as well. So very effective. Whoop. Okay, so this is something, the network format that seems very, I should not use the word authentic to such a critical audience, but it seems very much of the region and of the country, of your country as well. So here are a few of the innovations that I have seen come out of my study of the networks. And again, I can't write without talking about the networks. And they just always seem to be at the foundation of whatever it is that I'm observing, learning from in terms of gender and sexuality-based mobilization in Latin America. Okay, so one fundamental thing about the network model is how value-driven it is, right? And not to say that those values have remained the same, but attempting to have a means-end relation that in constructing networks and in the way the networks operate and the criticism that arises within the networks that then shifts their operational principles, these are always driven by values. And I think one really important thing to do as you're developing whatever organizational structure you may be focused on is that you spend some time in what we would call discernment about what those values are that you want to see embodied in the collective work that you hope to do. I would say that one of the advantages that you have that earlier networks did not have is that I know, because I know your work and I have met so many of you, that in your network, that this should be a network where you hold space for diversity. But I do think that that is also historically rooted, and that has been very hard fought in your region, as I know you are all continuing to experience. And the pragmatic construction, right, the organizational construction of a network that can hold space for diversity, right, is something, there are lessons about this. But figuring out how to do that again pragmatically is a challenge that I'm sure you are up to, again, because I see this as so deeply embedded in the kind of values I've heard from you. But how you hold space pragmatically in your network, right? That has to be worked through in terms of thinking about what that organizational structure will literally look like. And what I have seen is that the broader you want the network to be, the more that in a sense, the more conjunctural you want it to be. Because as you want to enable the expression of different identities, include different institutions, individuals who are located in their academic and activist trajectories at very different points in their life experience, right? One thing that's so extraordinary here is you have undergraduates, graduate students, early career professors, more established professors. I know you also have very important connections to people who identify as being part of the policy space, the nonprofit space, NGO space, ONG space, and activism, in popular areas. So how you bring people together in a network, respecting their diversity, sometimes that network has to have some flexibility to it, so that you don't expect the same thing from everybody, and that you don't expect the network to be some kind of a hard and fast structure where everybody pays dues and their meetings quarterly, and it looks like the same thing for everybody. So that's something to consider, depending on how big you want it to be. Okay, so community building arenas as part of the network. So one thing that, again, you can tell how hesitant I am about saying this to you because you live this, but I'm sure you've seen the importance of what in Spanish is called the asamblea to the development of the mass movements that characterize Latin America right now around gender and sexuality and bodily sovereignty. They continue to be fundamental for the explosion of mass movements in Argentina and Chile. My guess is you also use them in Brazil. And that is the space of really base level democratic exchange in maybe your foros, but that you see that as a key element of network building, but also of network existence. That place for horizontal exchange, however that's formulated, seems to be one of the primary innovations that has been very, very successful, particularly with diverse inclusion. So that, is a space for horizontality. And here I've said things that I know for those of you who perhaps have more trajectory inside the academy, you're thinking, oh, that's very nice, Elisabeth, Professor Elisabeth, but you know how it is, right? We have to get things done. Grants have to be written. Then we have reports that have to be written and turned in so that we can have some, real resources to support these networks. Institutional anchors are fundamental wherever those happen. And having clear institutional anchors with a clear sense of what can the people who have the resources or have the connections to the institution provide for the network, provides, again, for, if you will, the sort of skeleton upon which you can hang other elements of the network. It doesn't mean that the same institution has to always be there. And of course, that kind of turning over is an interesting politics in itself. But institutional anchors can provide really important resources to enable the networks to thrive. Rotating leadership seems to be a wonderful way of not only distributing resources, distributing the experience of what it means to be in leadership, even when that's leading from behind, even when that's a more collaborative leadership, but that it rotates among, sort of different institutions, and then, as you know, rotates around the country. because when you bring the network, the leadership of the network somewhere new, that of course enables that new space to find out about it, to connect to it, to feel a sense of ownership. So that seems to have been very important. And then finally here, the incorporation of digital modalities, and I won't have much to say here at all because I've been so, I learned from you all here. I do think that this is a really wonderful time, though, of thinking very concretely about how to incorporate digital modalities from the inception so that their incorporation isn't an add-on, a little extra tool, but that the incorporation of digital modalities is as driven by your value system as the development of the network in itself. Because as you all know, there are a lot of tensions built into the digital modalities that are most available to us because, as you all know, they are not free. They are not free. They feast on your data. They are expert at harvesting that data. They are not interested in your human rights, in your privacy, in your end goals. They're there to make money from your data. And so figuring out how to subvert that, even as you use the supposedly free tools, and look into other digital modalities that perhaps have your values more centrally while keeping everybody safe, right? That if you can think about those issues as you're building out your network, it will be much more sustainable and safe and effective, I think, going forward. So that's